In the run-up to this budget, we find ourselves in the midst of another heated debate about our public services. Are they really at breaking point, or is there room for further efficiencies? Now, no one in this debate is being deliberately post-truth, but the facts of the matter often remain rather opaque. This is the very simple mission of Performance Tracker, to shed some light on the state of public services across the board by drawing together publicly available data. Now, the IFG and CIPFA both work to make government more effective, and it is fundamental to increasing that effectiveness that ministers, officials and the public know how well government is performing and use this information to guide decisions. Now, the ambition is that this publication will eventually look across the board at a broad range of government activities. But in this first edition, we focused on just 5 public services. Those are schools, police, prisons, hospitals and adult social care. And yes, that is me and my nan. Now, there are lots of different ways that you could judge the performance of these services. But we wanted to judge the government on its own terms. Both the previous coalition and the current Conservative governments have pledged to control spending, but not at any cost. They also committed to maintaining or even expanding and improving the scope and quality of public services. So in these terms, how has government performed over the last 7 years? Did they actually manage to get more for less? So we found that the 2010 spending review was initially successful. There are clear signs in the data of efficiencies across services in this early period. Broadly speaking, government really did manage to control spending and maintain quality up to around 2013. However, by and large, this wasn't achieved by long-term reforms to the way these services operate, so digital transformation or service integration, but by short-term belt-tightening measures like wage freezes and frontline staff cuts. And in the run-up to 2015, the pressure started to bite. Things like A&E waiting times and prison violence started to creep up. Now, these pressures were clearly visible in the data in the run-up to the 2015 spending review. But there is little sign that the settlements handed to those departments were driven by a fundamental assessment of how those services had fared after 2010. And since the spending review, the existing problems have escalated. And between the 2015 spending review and now, government has already twice been forced into emergency action on prisons and on adult social care. Now, we argue that if government carries on like this, bouncing from crisis to crisis in this way, it risks a disastrous combination of failing public services and/or breached spending controls against a backdrop, of course, of deeply contentious Brexit negotiations. So we're calling on government to tackle the wishful thinking which underpinned and undermined those 2015 spending review settlements. So, in the police service, between 2009 and 2016, spending and staff numbers were both cut quite heavily, by 17% and 14% respectively. Despite this, public and victim satisfaction in the service has held up. In schools, spending increased, roughly in line with rising pupil numbers, and educational standards were maintained. But there are now teacher recruitment and retention pressures building up, and schools face budget constraints ahead. Now, there's more about those 2 services in the report itself, but in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the other 3, on hospitals, adult social care, and prisons. So as I said, the 2010 spending review was initially successful. Government did manage to control spending, but of course that's not the same as cutting spending. In fact, in total, across all 5 services, spending actually rose between 2009 and 2016. But a spending increase can feel like a cut if demand is rising even faster. So, for example, up to 2012-13, spending on hospitals rose by 6%, but the number of people admitted to hospital just via A&E rose by 14% and has continued to rise. And it's not just A&E admissions. Across the board, hospitals are having to do more work. Elective admissions, cancer treatments, GP referrals, diagnostic tests, they're all up over this period. Now, unlike hospitals, our other 2 services did see spending cuts. So spending on adult social care was down almost 8% in 2012-13 on 2009-10 levels, and spending on prisons fell by 11%. But spending is, of course, only one side of the performance equation. While spending was being controlled, what was happening to the scope and quality of these services? In 2009, 98% was the government's target for how many people would be seen at A&E within 4 hours. In 2010, that target was dropped to 95%, but we can see that that target was being largely met all the way up to the end of 2012. So while demand for services was going up, it appears that that increased spending might have allowed hospitals to absorb those greater numbers without making people wait longer. And we can see that at the other end of the hospital journey as well, at discharge. So when someone has been officially declared fit for discharge, but for some reason they can't actually be released from hospital, it is recorded as a delayed transfer of care, as many of you will know. Now, the two most common reasons for delay are waiting for a care package at home and waiting for a nursing home placement. And we can see that while still quite high, at around 14,000 days per month each, the number of days people were delayed due to these reasons remained broadly flat in this early period. Over in prisons, we see a similar story. So assaults on prisoners were broadly flat, as were assaults on staff. So in its own terms, in this early period, government was performing well, according to these particularly illustrative indicators, but also to the many other indicators that we've collected in our report. Government was indeed controlling spending and maintaining, if not always improving, the quality of services. But in the run-up to 2015, pressures started to emerge. So in hospitals, spending rose. It was 11% higher in 2014-15 than it had been in 2009-10. But the number of people waiting for A&E for longer than 4 hours also grew. And as you can see, hospitals stopped hitting that 95% target. Now, this isn't the only example of queuing in prisons that has emerged. Waiting times for some cancer treatment, waiting times targets for some cancer treatments and for non-urgent conditions have also been breached. An increasing number of people are waiting longer than 28 days for their cancelled operations to be rescheduled. Yet it's important to note that once patients actually get through the door and onto a ward, the standard of care that they received has actually got higher. So bacterial infections, things like MRSA, have been decreasing year on year. Pressure ulcers, which are a good indicator of the level of attention that patients are able to receive on wards, was also going down. Now, of course, we remember that this was happening in the wake of the Mid-Staffordshire scandal and the subsequent Francis review into patient safety. But in order to do that, hospital staffing levels have been maintained, and those staff have simply not allowed the quality of care to deteriorate. But in order to do that, in the context of rising demand, as well as making patients wait longer, hospitals were running record deficits, with 9 out of 10 acute providers in deficit at the end of 2015-16. In adult social care, spending continued to fall. In 2014-15, spending was 10% lower than in 2009-10, and those hitherto flat delayed transfers of care started to creep up. Now, delayed transfers are complex, and they signify issues across different sectors and providers, but there were other clear signs of pressure building up in adult social care. So some local authorities, unable to run up deficits in the way that hospitals can, squeezed the fees that they paid to independent providers of state-funded care, pushing some of them out of the market. And we don't have data for the earlier period, but in the first half of 2016, 380 care homes closed down, compared with 260 in the first half of 2013. And the volume of service provision has been squeezed not just at an institutional level, but at an individual level. So up to 2013-14, the number of people receiving state-funded adult social care services fell by a quarter. Now, these reductions were mostly taking place amongst community care services. That's things like Meals on Wheels or support at home from a professional. But more intensive residential and nursing care also fell up to 2013-14 by around 5%. Now, in prisons, spending continued to fall, and so did frontline staff numbers. And, as we can see here, violence also started to increase. At the same time, the so-called rehabilitation revolution is not hugely evident. So much has been said in recent months and weeks, in particular, about the increase of drug use in our prisons. Yet between 2009-10 and 2014-15, the number of prisoners completing accredited substance misuse programs fell by 88%. by the time the 2015 spending review rolled around, the pressures on public services were very clear in the data. But it appears that this information was not feeding into decision making. So at the 2015 spending review, the NHS received an £8 billion injection of cash, but that was of course predicated on £22 billion worth of efficiencies, going way beyond what had been achieved in the previous Parliament. And this front-loaded money is already getting absorbed into meeting deficits. Now, local government settlements are complicated, but adult social care received broadly flat funding in 2015. But of course, that's in the context of a rapidly ageing population and growing numbers of working-age adults with long-term needs. And what about the MOJ, the department responsible for our increasingly violent prisons? Well, they received a further 15% cut. Now, our other two services, schools and police, were faring broadly better at this point. So in schools, spending rose overall in line with pupil numbers, as I said, and standards were maintained. The police managed a 17% reduction in spending without a notable fall in quality. And in 2015, both of those budgets were protected. So what happened next? Well, the data suggests that the bad situations got worse. So in 2015-16, hospital spending continued to rise, now 14% higher than it was in 2009-10, but as you can see, A&E departments got further away from that waiting time target. Adult social care received a cash boost from the Better Care Fund, but it was too late to affect the delayed transfers of care, which rocketed. Prison spending continued to fall to 21% lower in 2015-16 than it was in 2009-10. And as you can see, violence spiralled. Assaults on staff were 60% higher in 2016 than they were just 2 years previously. So by 2016, the intensification of these longer-term trends had pushed prisons beyond breaking point and hospitals and social care towards it. And just a year after the spending review, the government was twice forced into emergency action. At the autumn statement, the Chancellor announced money for 2,500 new prison officers, effectively bringing staffing back up to 2014 levels. A month later, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government announced that local authorities would be allowed to bring forward council tax increases to plug their social funding gaps. So that's the social care precept. Now, in the upcoming budget, the Chancellor has the opportunity to make further cash injections into services like these to relieve some of the pressures in the short term. And it was indeed reported over the weekend that that's what he's planning to do for social care. But this cycle of allowing problems to fester, waiting for crisis and then injecting cash is inefficient and unsustainable. If it's going to manage continued financial constraint into the next Parliament and genuinely embed efficiency in public services, government has to tackle the kind of wishful thinking which underpinned those 2015 spending review settlements. So that's why we're calling on government to do three things. Firstly, to track the performance of government services in a consistent way, just as we've done here, so that they can make informed decisions about public spending across the board and respond to these problems before crises hit. Secondly, to publish that tracker, or at least publish the assumptions which underpin their spending decisions. And finally, to subject those assumptions to independent scrutiny so that someone else can assess their realism, someone like perhaps an OBR for public spending. Now, we'll be publishing the next edition of Performance Tracker before the first autumn budget later this year. And so we've got another 6 months of, 6 happy months of tracking the performance of government until then. And in the meantime, we hope that government will put a more robust programme of planning and performance management in place. So at the end of 2017, we'll be able to give you some good news about the government's grip on the spending challenge. Thank you.